Which role-playing game or games, I suppose, have had the greatest influence on your own design philosophy and the way you go about creating a new game?
Fuck, I hate this kind of question because what are your influences is so broad and you can end up going in all kinds of weird different directions. I think the biggest influence on my role-playing design philosophy is not starting with Dungeons and Dragons. See, for the vast and overwhelming majority of people who are role players, they got their start with Dungeons and Dragons, and that instills in you a very particular set of values and ideas. In the same way that, you know, everyone studies Shakespeare and certain other, you know, well-known authors, playwrights and so on in school in English, and that instills a certain common language, I guess, and a common understanding of English that can be quite limiting, I think. I think that so many people start with Dungeons and Dragons is limiting, and even though it is obviously hugely influential and important and has influenced every other game you care to mention, I think that's limiting to a lot of people. And so I think that for me it has been a huge boon not to have started with Dungeons and Dragons, because I was always aware that there were other systems. I was always aware that there were other worlds and approaches and genres and so on. So I started with MERP, Middle-earth role-playing, which was based off Rollmaster, which was a kind of highly crunchy mathematical simulationist sort of system, but based in a world, Tolkien, which I loved and which was a huge influence on gaming as a whole. But when I went into this little model shop in Basingstoke to buy my first role-playing game and bought MERP, it was obvious that there were lots of other games there. There was Dungeons and Dragons, there was BECME and Advanced, but there was also other books. It's a very hazy memory, many years ago now, but I'm pretty sure Space Master was there as well. Traveller, one version or the other of it in there, but there were a lot of games and I had choice and I could go through and I could look, and Middle-earth role-playing was the one I settled on for whatever reason. But before that I had been playing Fighting Fantasy and things like that, and when I first met up with other gamers, they weren't Dungeons and Dragons players either. They were playing Twilight 2000 and Dragon Warriors and a whole host of other things, including some military board games and things as well. So yeah, not starting with D&D, that was important. I think I am heavily influenced by the things that my father is into, I should say. The paperback science fiction of the 60s, 70s and 80s. And the kind of experimental punk and new wave post-punk music that he had a lot of albums of, the heavy metal that a lot of my friends were into, those paperbacks. And yeah, I'm mostly talking about the kind of the new wave from the late 70s through to the 80s, particularly, I suppose, Harl and Ellison. Does it show? 2000 AD, the comic anthology series, is a huge influence on my life. The British comic that is still going, that I've been reading since I was about 3 years old. That's not as good as it used to be, unfortunately. Not as daring as it used to be. But yeah, that's a huge thing, and that contains science fiction stories, fantasy stories, horror stories, the neo-pagan tinged works of Pat Mills, Judge Dredd, serious topics, but always with a touch of humour to it. Fantastic artists. Brian Talbot worked in 2000 AD for a bit. There was a sort of steampunky epic in Nemesis the Warlock that's always stuck with me. So that's important. More and Morrison and Ellis later on than perhaps Gaiman, who, while I love his work and appreciate Gaiman, he can sometimes be a little bit twee, perhaps. Morrison, Moore and Ellis are more my speed, I would say. The fighting fantasy books, obviously, very British. Lone Wolf, Warhammer, more the early days than the more recent stuff. Dragon Warriors, obviously. British role-playing games. I've tried to articulate this, and it's difficult, but they do have a particular character to them. A dark sense of humour, a satirical undercurrent, a tapping into the kind of syncretic British mythology that we've got. Arthurian myth and legend on the one hand, and pagan holdovers on the other. Every village, every town is stuffed to the gills with stories about ghosts or fairies or whatever around here. That can't help but bleed over. British humour and satire, Blue Jam, The Day to Day, The Young Ones, Fast Show, Fry and Laurie, Bottom, those kind of things. They're a big influence. Art is a huge influence. Tim White, massive. Jim Burns, massive. Dave Alsop, to go to a sort of gaming related artist. Michael Whelan, Chris Akios, plenty of others. Game wise, I guess coming back to games, Cyberpunk, SLA Industries, Vampire, Lamentations of the Flame Princess. These all have a very strong vision and style to them, and they really brought home that presentation is a huge factor, especially Lamentations. It's basically a simple version of D&D, but with certain stylistic choices and a method of presentation that makes it seem like something different and new, and makes it something different and new. Genre emulation, Feng Shui. I'm always banging on about Feng Shui, or Call of Cthulhu. Those really brought home to me the importance of genre emulation and how system and world should work together synergistically to create something more effective. I played in LARP games for a decade of Vampire the Masquerade, and that made me very aware of the potential for self-sustaining games, and the importance of social interactions, and how a change in the rules can encourage or discourage a certain style of play or way of going about things. So that was important, I think. And more generally, as a sort of umbrella over everything, my experiences with the Satanic Panic, bullying, video nasties, Vampire Panic, panics over heavy metal and the occult, having Christians come into school and propagandize us with a video called Doorways to Danger, which spelled out how terrible role-playing games and tarot cards and heavy metal music was. So instilling in me a very strong sense of fuck you to anybody who tells me what to do. And that punk rock attitude, I guess. God, it's such a wide question. I don't really know how to answer it, but hopefully that was kind of an answer.